Welcome to the second episode of the PhalanxCast. This is Gabor Berkics again. I'm the business development manager of the Phalanx Software Ltd, business software development company. This is the second episode of our podcast series, and I'd like to welcome our guests, Kyle Pullicino, the CEO and the founder of Phalanx Software, and Nicholas Buttigieg, software engineer at Phalanx Software as well. So all of us are colleagues. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining the podcast today. Today, we are going to speak about a very interesting topic, which is open source in general, open source in softwares. So we are very involved in these things. We use a lot of open source software uh, within our daily activities, and also there are very interesting things in the world which use open source software as well. So, Kyle, could you give us a short overview or the idea behind the open source in theory and in practical?
Yes, so first of all, thank you for uh, inviting me again and for hosting the podcast again. Um, and as you said, we are going to be discussing open source. And it's amazing how very few people know about what it means, even though it has become so pervasive in our lives. Open source is the philosophy where the the code that underlies the software that we run is freely available for the public to look at. Now, a lot of people would say that that's not very useful because the public in general is not skilled enough to understand what the code means, how to read it, what it does, what it means. But the philosophy itself implies a certain amount of transparency. That means that, okay, maybe you do not understand what the code that your phone is running. You can't read it yourself because you're not skilled. You're not a programmer yourself. But the fact that the code was made public and available online for everyone to see means that whoever's running code on your phone has this transparent uh, philosophy and stance. And other people might want to, maybe not yourself, but other people are able to go in and check that the code running on your phone is not doing anything malicious, for example. So, yeah, that is open source. And it has become so pervasive in our life. In fact, there's a reason I mentioned phones, because I think it's the best example of how popular open source software has become. Most Android phones are running a version of Linux. It's an open source operating system. So um, you can go on the web and check, look at the code that your phone is running. So that is the idea behind open source. That's the philosophy, and it's the um, we'll go into more detail during the podcast now.
Yes, so thank you. Nicholas, what do you think? What could be if you would talk with a friend of yours who is not really involved in technology, just very generally using a smartphone, of course, using a laptop for work, and would ask you that, Nikki, can you tell me something? What is in it for me? What would you say?
Um, so open source, while like I feel it's used a lot relating to code, doesn't have to be just about code. You can have open source licenses for hardware, for other types of data like photos. So it's the entire philosophy is you could be used in many places by many people. You don't have to be a programmer. And as like building on what Kyle said, it's also like it's so open source software or open source work has a license attached to it, and that license allows you to either freely distribute it or modify it or um, make it your own. Sometimes you can even take an open piece of work and like internally within a company have a closed version of that as well. Depends on the licenses you choose.
How would you convince someone who's not very involved in technology and doesn't know much about it that it could be a
Okay, yeah.
useful thing, and what is in it for that person?
Thanks. So yeah, the general idea of having work that someone does put out there and legally allow it to be redistributed or modified, it enables access to a wider range of people for things. So you don't have to, you might not need to be working at a company or at a specific university to be able to access some kind of work. It's freely available online. So I think and the ability to go and see what the application you're using or the phone you're using, if there's anything's running that you might not you want to know about, data privacy concerns. um, yeah, I think a lot of people, again, if you're looking at code, you have to have some sort of understanding of the code, but at the end of the day, if it's open, there's someone out there who's going to have some sort of understanding of the code. So you might not need to do the job yourself, but once it's open, someone will probably go have a look at it, and if you can't understand it, you can turn to them.
Okay, so as I see, accessibility and reflections on your work are an important part of this. How does it look like the community part? I mean, so if someone is developing an open source code, how do you get feedback from other people who are interested? How does it work in reality,
um,
Kyle?
So it's building an open source community is surprisingly not easy. Uh, it's it's much more easy to build proprietary and closed source software because there's much.
Sorry, just for our listeners, could you please just explain a little bit what are these two categories? Who are not
All right, so
for the listeners who are not doing tech jobs like us?
we've got open source is, as we said, uh, code that is available online that anyone can see, modify, and make their own. Whereas closed source or proprietary means that it is code which um, is typically owned by a individual or a company that no one can verify or they can't check. So again, most of the commercial software is um, proprietary or closed source, but most of the more widespread software is open source. So an operating system on our phone is open source, but then Office software, some word processing software like Microsoft Word, would be proprietary because you cannot go in and look at the code. So as I was saying, the building a community for an open source project is much more difficult because when it comes to proprietary code, it's usually a company that owns their own product and they start from scratch and they decide what to do with it, how to develop it, what features go in, what features stay out, how much to, what price they have to, what price they will charge their clients, and so on. But in open source, now you need to deal with the fact that firstly, your code needs to be is intended to be read by everyone else. So you have to have things like good documentation and good usage notes, for example. You need to also keep a constant channel of communication open with your users because it's open source, so you don't know who's there on the other side. Unlike in a company, uh, everyone is in an office, and if we want to change something with the software, all it takes is just to a meeting with my colleagues in the company. But in open source, you typically don't even know who is leaving feedback or who your users are. And it is, from what I've heard now, I've never been leading an open source project myself. But from what I've heard, running an open source project is a very thankless job. So you hear these stories of people getting loads of feedback about their projects that they've made open source, and you have to deal with toxic feedback, you have to deal with constructive feedback, but you also have to deal with loads of feedback. Imagine we've just mentioned earlier the Linux project. The Linux project involves hundreds and hundreds of developers. How are you going to coordinate all those people together? Everyone with their own opinion, everyone can has their own agenda, and perhaps what makes it a bit difficult as well is that the project is in use by for-profit companies, so they also have their own agenda. They're trying to push their own products as well into the field. So there's a lot of this thing going on, but surprisingly, I think it works somehow. The nature of the the nature of the philosophy works, and we've ended up with a lot of interesting software packages that are open source, and they're very, very good. I don't know if we want to mention some software that for sure people have heard of. Let's take VLC, for example. Everyone has used VLC. It's a lot of people, when they install a new when they buy a new laptop or a new PC, the first thing they install on it is VLC. So it is a open source project, and that is what makes it very good then, because when there's a problem or the bug or there's a new format, someone can just go in, fix it, and there you go, distribute it to everyone.
Yeah, if I may add to that as well, having it open gives people the ability to actually spot and report bugs as well. So you end up having your users basically testing it for you and giving them the power to actually fix the bug, because you end up with so many bugs and issues to fix that, first of all, you have to prioritize what you're going to work on. So if you have a big user base, then you can spread that workload between a lot of people. And an interesting, like I've never managed an open source project either, but I have worked on a couple, just explored a couple, and you end up getting, I think what's probably really hard to manage is that you end up having a lot of users with varying skill levels. So you end up having, or you could end up having, quite a lot of people interested in your project who would have no programming background, or people who have been programming for 20-30 years, and ideally everyone's important in one way or another. You can gain something. Everyone stands something to add to your product, or not product, open source project. So I think it's probably pretty hard to have a sort of onboarding system in place for people of varying skill levels. Whether it's good documentation or good clear code or guidelines on how to navigate the project. Because I mean, sometimes you go on GitHub and you go on an open source project and there's 10 packages and 100 files, and it's just very overwhelming. Like, where do you start from? So it's not an easy thing to manage, for sure.
I see. Recently, it was announced that the next lunar rover by NASA, the project is called Viper, will use open source code. I'm not an expert in this actually, but Nikki, could you please highlight it? What are we talking about, and what's the reason that such a high profile, very expensive project is reliant on open source?
Sure. So I'm not an expert either, but I came across an interesting article
More than me, that's for sure.
on MIT's MIT had posted an article on their technology review newsletter about this particular lunar rover that I think is going to be launched in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. Um, that's making use of some open source software. Um, if I recall correctly, it's for varying uses of for varying applications of the rover. But what I found interesting is that you've got an industry space which is typically very heavily reliant on proprietary closed source systems that are like heavily tested and as bug free as possible, because the applications and environments in which the code is used or the hardware or whatever the work is used in is they need to make sure that it's up to standards. Um, and so I thought it was pretty interesting that open source software is being used more and more in these areas. And as we're seeing more countries and more people get interested in space exploration, um, people might not afford or might not have access to certain closed systems. So the more open source tools we have, the more accessible you make certain parts of that entire pipeline, whether it's the actual hardware. I mean, there's a if I recall correctly, there's a foundation called Libre Space Foundation. I might be getting that incorrect, but they have a whole range of open source tools from hardware like open source physical satellites to the software running on the satellites. Um, so this makes the access to space and space exploration is more accessible to many more people. I mean, given that you've got connection to internet. Um, so so yeah, we can talk a lot about more about this, but the NASA in general have a website, code.nasa.gov probably, where they have a list of all their open source tools they've built. So NASA themselves, as an organization, have also built a lot of tools which they've put out for the public to review, look at, distribute, learn from, whatever you want to do with it, really. And there's quite a few. I think they already use a couple open source tools and some robots on the International Space Station as well. Um, but yeah, it's nice to see, because a lot of the times I feel like open source projects can be a bit messy and if not very well organized sometimes, even though there are some great, very well structured projects. But to apply like in such an industry where testing and stability is so important, maybe some people will be a bit on the fence about introducing and including open source packages in such work.
Um, so I don't want to derail the conversation, but
No.
what brings to mind is the fact that it's a government project that is using open source. And to tell you the truth, I wish more governments around the world used this kind of philosophy and style of organizing their IT systems for less extreme use cases. So here we are using open source for space exploration, which to be maybe to be fair, maybe does not affect the citizen in the street every day, single day. But I wish the same thing was used much more extensively for in other fields and other areas. So um, it's it's a nice start, and I mean it's admirable that they're taking the plunge in this case. But I hope that the whole open source trend picks up for other things as well.
Wait,
government.
once
What
you
areas of life could you imagine that has a much more much bigger impact on on an ordinary citizen, which is organized by the government somehow, that could be made open source?
I mean, literally any government process can probably be open sourced.
so
Like the process, so the way government processes work usually are encoded in law somewhere, so they're written out. So it's already an open source process. I wish IT systems that implement those processes were also open source. So, for example, I believe the UK government
yeah,
has its website and web portals are all open source. In fact,
they even have their entire infrastructure scripts out in the open.
exactly. And for example, the UK government does this. I wish more governments do it, and it would be, and every year uh, there are these financial statements coming out, or um, saying how much money was spent on modernizing and digitalizing our systems around the world. Okay, or you'll hear it a lot sometimes. Some government department says we are spending, we are investing millions of euros to modernize our digital system, and then there's no, you don't see the result because it's not open source. And if they had used open source, everyone could contribute to make that process better. They'd save a lot of money. The process would, the whole thing, the application, the end result would be better because any mistakes that are visible, people will um, resolve them, help you resolve them. And it's it feels like a very natural place to do it, because I always wonder how can a government that's committed to transparency, that's the whole point of having a democratic government, that you need to be very transparent. How are all their systems closed source? We can't check what they're doing, what's happening behind the scenes, and
If I
yeah.
can if I can add to that, because it's an interesting point that you bring up, and I remember when I had first learned that the UK government has a bunch of projects on GitHub, which is a place where a lot of open source code lives. They had a statement which caught my eye, but they differentiated between open source and coding in the open. Um, and that's sort of coming from a place where, from my understanding at least, they, as a government, they're not ready to create a community around the project. They don't have the, I mean, for whatever reasons that might be, but they want to put the code out there for people to see. So it's like it's open source. I mean, they're not, I don't believe they like allow you to submit changes to it, but it's out there for people to have a look at. But there's no open source community, I believe, around the UK government's projects,
Okay.
which would be nice as well. I think that would be definitely useful.
But if you think about it, democracy itself is an open source invention, perhaps the oldest one, because if we stick to the last example, that the code would be the laws actually, and the people who can change the laws or create new ones are the MPs, who are elected by the people, by the adult population. Of course, if we are speaking of a democracy, so I think the whole philosophy of democracy is very like-minded to open source.
And then when it comes to IT, for some reason it stops there then. So it's unfortunate. And you know why it happens though? It's again, by time, I feel like we said this the last time as well, but over time, people will become more knowledgeable about this, and I mean, the EU is doing a lot of good work in this field as well.
What do you mean?
They have a lot of open source initiatives going on. We have worked. We have worked on the ESCF standard recently to tag and to tag company financial statements in a machine readable format. The whole point there is to make company financial statements more open and interoperable with a different number of tools. In the past, something like this would be the way it would have worked in the past. It would be that you have to use a very specific, costly piece of software that was developed by a particular company. You had no other option to do that. You have to pay them thousands and thousands of euro because they're the only ones who have this benefit of providing the service, and everyone, if they want to read your report, they have to be using the software and so on. So something like this is an attempt to open, make data more open and more interoperable with the community at large. And yes, so another example that comes to mind. Sorry if I keep mentioning examples, but I hope I can get the point across. Maybe through this podcast, maybe it changes someone's mind. Maybe, who knows?
Of course, that's one of the reasons that we are doing this, to educate
Exactly.
people.
So
So examples are always great. It helps to connect people with something. So carry on, please.
exactly. So schools, for example. Now schools, I know how much they try to balance their budgets, how much expenses they have, how much um, they find it very difficult to make sure they pay their staff well, that they don't waste any money. And then you go in there and you start seeing Microsoft Windows installed everywhere. Every computer has a Microsoft Office license. There's a so many different proprietary. The VPN is a Cisco VPN, so that's another closed source VPN, and I find it very ironic for it to go in when it happens in schools, because the whole point of a school is to be open and teach people about technology. But how can you learn how technology works if you can't look at the code? And I wish, for example, more schools. We're a company based in Malta. I wish more Maltese schools adopted open source from the get-go, so they'll have Linux on their PCs installed. They'll have I'm mentioning all the open source software. LibreOffice installed. They'll have we mentioned the VPN, something like Tink or OpenVPN to connect everything. And you'll see, it's much more. They'll save a lot of expenses when it comes to IT, and also it encourages their students to look into technology more.
Yeah, if I can build off of that a bit, I think it's also quite interesting, like as we're seeing industries using open source software more and more. I feel like there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between education and industries, in the sense that if we introduced more open source software and tools within educational institutions, there'd be maybe a bit of a less of a learning curve as well. Sometimes when you move into an industry, like I mean, for example, in machine learning, like you've got two big libraries, Keras and TensorFlow. Keras and TensorFlow, and PyTorch as well, just for two examples, which are heavily used in the industry. And nowadays, you also see them used in universities and in modules as tools to the practical aspects of that course. So it's like you're bridging the gap of between a learning curve there. Whereas if you go into a company who uses some proprietary software, there's going to be a few more things and a bit of a steeper learning curve. So I think that's also quite important as well. Um, yeah.
Uh, we've been talking about open source in general in the world, in the philosophical part, but let's move the topic to a bit of to the practical side. We at Phalanx Software, how do we make use of open source softwares? How does it help our work? Maybe if someone is thinking about turning to us because they think they lack the experience or the knowledge, what could we offer in this case? Kyle, what do you think?
So when I founded the company, from the get-go, I said I'm going to run the company a bit different than how these kind of businesses are run traditionally. Traditionally, you open a company, you buy a laptop with you buy PCs with Microsoft Windows installed on them already, and you start looking for project management tools, Atlassian Jira, and all these different closed source tools. And I questioned whether it's possible to run a business without using any of this, using pretty much open source technology. And I think both of you can attest to the fact that it is possible. Okay, we use a lot of open source software. We don't have Windows, we use Linux, for example. You can see here the podcast is being recorded on Jitsi. Okay, so that's everyone when the pandemic started is immediately I need video software, so I'm going to pay for it. Zoom, what else? Microsoft Teams,
Skype for Business.
Skype for Business. Yes, is another one. I've heard a lot of stories about that. But we went with Jitsi, and as you can see, it works. I would hazard to say that it works better than the proprietary software that I've mentioned, because, for example, Zoom has been the victim of a lot of security problems in the past, loads of security problems. But Jitsi, it runs well. The connection is fine, and we've managed to do pretty much everything we needed to do with it. We use also, even when running our business, we don't. If we have documents to write spreadsheets, we use open source software, so we don't use Excel or Word. We have LibreOffice for that, and I encourage, if there is any business owners listening in on this podcast, to contact us and question whether they might start saving on IT expenses, transition to a more open source way of doing things, and for that you get the help that an open source community gets you. It's no longer, if something goes wrong with your software, it's no longer you have to contact the supplier and hope that they fix the problem for you, but rather you can do it yourself. You can just fix the problem yourself, or reach out to the community and all the information that's posted out there online, and and get that benefit from all that.
What could you say? A usual concern what I hear about this is that, oh yes, we are using closed softwares of big companies, it costs a lot, but they are well-known brands, they've been in the industry for decades, so I can't risk to put my business in jeopardy if an open source software breaks down. And many people think that because it's for free, the quality is lower. So what could you guys say to these concerns?
I was so I think one important factor to mention as well is when you use open source software, you're generally hosting it yourself. So you're taking care of actually hosting that service and providing it. Which when you pay for a tool, that's generally handled by the company, who should, in theory, have good secure systems in place. But systems still get hacked and um, accessed. So I think like it's easy to say, host your own use open source software, but there's also a bit of work that needs to be done on the. You need to have the experience and the people and the knowledge to handle the systems,
Mhm.
um, have them secure the systems, not just handle them. Um, so that's one thing. I don't know if Kyle wants to mention any more.
I mean, it is, to be fair to them, Gabor, people who say that, it is a valid concern, okay? Not because um, open source software breaks down, but because uh, I understand the feeling that, let's speak about a CRM tool, okay? Big companies have a massive CRM tool that has um, loads of information on it. So having it out for a few days means that you're you're at the you your work stops. But after you think about it, you realize that even proprietary software suffers from this problem in the same exact way. I've had uh, I've had funnily enough, now it doesn't occur to me this much because now we are running all our services open source. But in the past, when I used to work for other companies, you'd have these managed services just crash, and you don't know why. You have to contact the supplier and figure out what's happening. So admittedly, yes, it's not just going to be some person without any experience at all and is just going to is going to install their software and so on. Even though it is possible, if this person is able to follow instructions, they should be able to get their open source software set up. But that is why uh, I feel like we are a different company to the rest. If someone is interested in investigating open source software for their business, they can speak to us. We will go through the requirements, exactly what's needed, and we will give our best opinion on what should be done and what setup should be put into place. And we will make sure that there's things like system availability, making sure that the system remains working as much as possible. And we'll also, because not all open source software projects are equal, some of them, just like like proprietary uh, products, some of them are not good. Okay, so we will look into which projects are good to use and which projects you should avoid. But yes, I encourage anyone who's listening in who has never considered this, who has always um, been of the mind that if you want something, if you want software, you have to pay for it, to think about what options there are, and they will be surprised. For sure, they will be surprised. We are running our entire business on open source software, and we're doing fine. So you can see that um, it is possible.
Let me add it here that you can, if anyone who's listening it and interested about it, you can find my contact details in the description of this video, or if you if you are listening to it, then on the podcast platform. So please feel free to reach out. I'm sure that that we can guide you through this, and it worth the time, because later on you will save a lot of.
Even if you're not a company and you're just, a 16-year-old student who doesn't have 200 euros to spend on a subscription for a piece of software. um, I mean, there's like, for example, the first thing that comes to mind is Blender, the 3D modeling and rendering application. Like a lot of the times, these big applications, closed source like Cinema 4D, for example, or many others, they require subscriptions and you have to pay for them. And a lot of students wouldn't be in a position to pay for a lot of software, so that shouldn't be a reason why people can't explore an interest. Um,
And just to say a very basic example for open source, which is used by billions in the world, is Wikipedia. So, for example, when I was a child, there were these big massive books, encyclopedias. A whole series of it could occupy your occupy your bookcase. Also, it costed a small fortune, and the informations, of course, became outdated in it. So but now everyone is using Wikipedia. This is a very good and early example, I think, of the philosophy of open source. And just to see in English, I don't know, it's like a billion titles, I think, or a lot, really. Even though I'm from Hungary, so my mother tongue is Hungarian, which is a language spoken by 10 million people in the world, and the Hungarian Wikipedia has more than a million titles. So it can give a good picture of the power of the whole thing.
Mhm. Exactly. I mean, the example you mentioned is like perfect, I think, because Wikipedia is truly. Um, in the past, they had the classical wonders of the world. I think Wikipedia is one of the
one of the
modern
seven
wonders of the
wonders.
world. Okay, they had the library, uh, the Great Library. It was one of the wonders. Now we have Wikipedia, and um, and also what you said, Nicholas, the um, students. Um, it's related to what we said about education as well. Like students cannot pay
Yeah.
this much money for all this proprietary software, and what companies tend to do when you're still a student is they will try to vendor lock you in as well. They
Yes.
do vendor lock, which they try to do with businesses as well, where they uh, try to get you to use their own product, and as we discussed earlier, there's no way to uh, back away from it. You are now locked into using um, their product, which is not it's completely doesn't go well with open source. Um, so that's what these companies sometimes try to do with students. They start giving out some free uh, free licenses or free subscriptions. But then you find out, when they go to they start their real job after graduating, they want to use this closed source
Mm.
software.
And
Yes, and
some
you end up feeling that you're in the mafia basically because there's a way in, but there's no way out. So it could be annoying after a while.
and sometimes closed source software is great as well. Like we don't, I mean, for example, JetBrains products, the programming IDEs, I've been using since I probably started programming a bit later maybe, and I've had the student free licenses, and it's not open source, but it's a great application. But yeah, like a lot of other closed source applications will have proprietary file formats, and you can only open the files in their applications and stuff like that. um, and what you mentioned, Gabor, about Wikipedia actually kind of angered me a bit, because you were right, but when at school and throughout university we had a bunch of lecturers and teachers saying don't use Wikipedia as a resource, don't reference Wikipedia. I mean, I never understood that, to be honest. It's a great resource.
Of course, and it's accessible to anyone. You can just have to have your smartphone, and I use it on a daily basis, even for a very very basic things. So this was the second episode of the Phalanx Cast. We were talking about open source, the philosophy, the practical part, the theoretical part, how we use it in our systems, how anyone could benefit from it, and also we were talking a little bit about using it in scientific expeditions, space science namely. Thank you for listening or watching or both. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channels, and also if you could comment and like or share this video or audio, we will be more than happy. Any questions are more than welcome as well. So thank you for being with us today, and I also like to thank you for Kyle and Nikki, their contribution. I've learned a lot myself, so I hope it was great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on